Hi everybody. In this video I want to review some basic terminology about poetry so that when we read poems this semester and again later this semester, we have some common terminology that we can use. Depending on your background in literature, you may be familiar with this stuff already and it may be a review for you. But yeah, if it is new and you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to follow up with me. I want to start with this quotation by one of my professors, my first English professor in college, who said this: "Poetry reveals, it doesn't conceal." And I'm reviewing that because so many times people think that poetry is extremely mysterious and they have to go searching for hidden meanings, and they try to torture an idea out of a poem that isn't really there because they think that that's what they're supposed to do. And I don't want us to think that way about poetry. I want us to look at what poetry is actually saying. But we also want to look at how poems are written, what kinds of tools poets are using when they write poetry. So I want to talk in this video about traditional poetic forms, rhyme schemes, and meters, and we'll spend some time on the sonnet in particular. And then we'll also talk about free verse. So let's go back to last week when we read "We Wear the Mask" by Paul Laurence Dunbar. This is the first stanza. "We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties." So this poem probably does what you expect, right? It has a rhyme scheme and it has a regular meter. So if we look at the rhyme, we assign a letter to each rhyme. So lies and eyes are letter A, they rhyme. Guile and smile are letter B, and then subtleties is kind of a half rhyme with lies and eyes. So we'll call that letter A. So we have an A, B, B, A rhyme scheme. So you see that it follows this pattern of rhyming, and that's what we expect with poetry, particularly before the Harlem Renaissance period, particularly before the 20th century. Now, I also want to look at meter, or in other words, the rhythm of the poetry. So I've bolded the syllables that we stress when we read it. "We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to hume and guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties." Now, I am exaggerating that rhythm as I read it, but you can see that every other beat is stressed, is bolded, okay? So, every unit of poetry is called a foot. A foot is a unit of measurement in a line of poetry that's made up of stressed and unstressed syllables. What we just read were iambs, made up of an unstressed and stressed syllable. "We wear," that's an iamb. "The mask" is another iamb. A trochee has a stressed syllable first, followed by unstressed, and so on. You can see that there are these different kinds of meters that you would see in poetry. And I'm not interested in having you memorize all of these right now. Perhaps if you become a graduate student and study poetry, you'll need to have all of these terms down. But for now, I want you to know what an iamb is. Again, a metrical foot, okay? And then when we look at a line of poetry, each line is made up of a certain number of feet. So monometer would be 1 foot in a line. Dimeter would be 2, trimeter would be 3, tetrameter would be 4, and pentameter would be 5, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so most poetry that we're familiar with that rhymes, that follows a metrical pattern, is either tetrameter or pentameter. In other words, it has either 4 stresses in a line, or pentameter would have 5 stresses in a line. Okay. So if we go back to Paul Laurence Dunbar, "We wear the mask that grins and lies." You can see here that each of these is an iamb, a foot. "We wear the mask that grins and lies." That's 4 feet in this line, so that's tetrameter. Okay, iambic tetrameter. Again, 4 iambs in the line. All right, so let's then talk about the sonnet form. The sonnet is derived from the Italian word for little song. And traditionally, the sonnet was expressly a love poem. particularly courtly love, and unrequited love. So Petrarch would write Italian sonnets in which the speaker would express his love for this woman who didn't love him back. A sonnet is always made up of 14 lines, and almost always iambic pentameter. Da 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 da, 5 stresses. So if you think of Shakespeare's famous sonnets, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" You can hear those 5 stresses. Of course, we don't read them in such an exaggerated way unless we're trying to make a point about iambic pentameter. There are different kinds of sonnets, the way that the patterns break down. Petrarch, the Italian guy I mentioned earlier, would write his sonnets with 8 lines and 6 lines, or an octave and a sestet to equal the 14 lines. But Shakespeare would typically write 3 quatrains, a quatrain meaning a group of 4 lines, plus a couplet. So mathematically, there are just different ways to get to 14. There are other models, other varieties as well, but those are the 2 most famous ones. And the other feature I want you to know about a sonnet is that it has a volta. A volta is Italian for turn. It's like a rhetorical shift where the speaker presents an idea and the last part of the poem kind of turns it on its head or offers a twist. Sometimes the word yet or but can be a signal of that volta, that turn. By the way, you've heard me mention the word speaker. In fiction, we talk about narrators, the narrator of the novel, The Underground Railroad, or the narrator of the story by Zora Neale Hurston. But in poetry, we talk about speakers, and speakers aren't always the same as the poet. The speaker can be a fictional creation and not necessarily the poet. So let's look at one of the most famous sonnets to come out of the Harlem Renaissance. Several of the poems that you're reading this week are sonnets, and I want you to see if you can identify them. Let's look at this one of my favorite poems. "I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind. And did he stoop to quibble, could tell us why the little buried mole continues blind, why flesh that mirrors him must someday die, make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited by the fickle fruit, declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Inscrutable his ways are, and immune to catechism by a mind too strown with petty cares to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing." So I want to briefly paraphrase this poem because I think it's so great. Look at these first 3 words. I doubt not. I don't doubt that God is good and well-meaning and kind. And if he stooped to quibble, if he bothered with such little details, he could explain these various problems. And then in these lines that follow, the speaker lays out these various problems. Why do we have moles that are created blind? Why do we all have to die? Why are we made in his image, but then we have to die? Tantalus is from Greek mythology, and he was tortured in the underworld by constant hunger, and food would dangle right above his head, but whenever he would reach for it, it would disappear right out of reach. And Sisyphus was the guy who was doomed to pushing a rock up a hill forever, a big, heavy boulder. And in one version, he never makes any progress anywhere. And in another version, he makes progress up the hill, but then it rolls back down and he has to start over. So you can see he's posing these problems. If God is good, then why do these problems exist? Well, then he goes on to say, inscrutable his ways are, we'll never understand. He's immune to catechism by a mind too strown with petty cares, to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. Awful meaning awesome in this word. So, in other words, we're never going to understand this. Our brains are too small. But look at the last couplet, the last 2 lines. Yet, there's the volta, yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. Now, this seems to be a poem about the plight of the black artist who has something to say and perhaps isn't taken seriously. We can talk in discussions more about how you interpret this poem, but right now I want to look at how it's written. So first of all, if we look at the rhythm, I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind, and did he stoop to quibble, could tell us why. That is roughly iambic pentameter with this extra syllable thrown in. So it's written with 5 stresses. I doubt not God is good, well-meaning, kind. 5 stressed beats, 5 iambs. So we call that iambic pentameter. And then if we look at how he has structured the rhyme scheme, we have 2 quatrains, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Sorry about the typo there. So we can see these 2 groupings of 4 lines, and then we have 3 couplets. In other words, a rhyming pair of lines at the end. And notice this yet signals the volta, where the poem turns, where he has kind of raised the stakes of the poem to get to what he's really wondering here. So this week I've mentioned that a few of the poems that I've assigned are sonnets. So see if you can find the ones that are 14 lines written on iambic pentameter. Most of the time they will rhyme. Sometimes they will not. I also want you to think about their purpose. Remember I said that originally a sonnet was a love song. Petrarch, the Italian originator of the form, as well as Shakespeare, used the sonnet to express their love. How are these poets expressing, what are these poems expressing in their sonnets? Okay, so that brings us to free verse. Free verse is poetry that has no regular pattern of rhythm and no regular pattern of rhyme. This is how a lot of poetry in the 20th and 21st centuries is written. I'm not saying that it has no rhyme or rhythm at all. What I'm saying is that there's no regular pattern of rhythm or of rhyme. So there's no iambic pentameter, there's no A-B. It flows freely. Let's look at an example of a poem written in free verse by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. I love this poem. It's wonderful. And this is free verse. This is, there is no rhyme scheme here. Brother and kitchen and America, they don't rhyme. And you can see even by just the length of the lines, they're not going to follow a pattern that you can find a beat to, right? So this is free verse. Okay, so keep in mind the words of my mentor, Dr. Owen, poetry reveals, it doesn't conceal. Look for what the poems want to say to you. Look for when the Harlem Renaissance poets are experimenting and trying something new, and look when they're using traditional forms, and keep thinking about the advantages that either would have for its audience. I'll see you in our discussions.